to get to a description of the one ultimate conscious agent, it's a theorem of our theory that there is one conscious agent. But to get to it, to actually describe it, we're going to have to climb up all of Cantor's hierarchy. Now, there's an infinite number of steps in Cantor's hierarchy, which means we cannot get there. So in 20,000 years, if we're still using this framework, and we've gotten to level 5 billion of Cantor's hierarchy, it's time to break out the champagne. We went through 500 billion levels. We're at Aleph 500 billion, and we learned a lot at every level. So we learned something new about consciousness every time we transcended and went to a new level. Time to break out the champagne. How much further do we have to go? Infinity. You're not any closer than when you started, and yet you learned a lot. And so what I love about this theory is it says there is the one conscious agent. And number two, using this theory, you'll never be able to describe it. But number three, you'll know precisely how far you've gotten and precisely how infinitely far you have to go at every step of the theory. So the theory itself predicts its own failure to actually describe an entity that it's a theorem exists from the theory. So that for me, that's one thing I love about the theory is that it tells me immediately how far I've gotten. And right now we're just at Aleph 0. We haven't even gotten to Aleph 1 yet. So we have a long way to go.
John, do you have any comments quickly?
Yeah. I want to know more about what is meant by conscious agent and what is meant by the rejection of space-time. But before I do that, I mean, the arguments aren't identical, but they converge. I mean, these are very, in that sense, convergent with Neoplatonic arguments that the one lies beyond all possible conceptualization. Because if you try to understand it, you have to understand it in terms of its structure or its cause, and therefore you haven't actually achieved the one, because you still would then have to get some system of intelligibility that explains the relationship between the structures and so you always are pointing towards an ultimate reality that can't ever be grasped. The source of intelligibility, the arguments go like the source of intelligibility can't itself be intelligible. And what was interesting is it sounded to me, Donald, and maybe I'm getting it wrong, it sounded to me like you got this sort of fractal oneing going all the way up, which means even your notion of the one is in some sense inadequate and it points beyond itself. And then the whole trajectory of all these ones points towards a one that is never graspable. That's what I heard you saying. And that sounds like Neoplatonism through to me profoundly. The part about the conscious agents I want to talk to you more about, but the structure of sort of, I should do it this way, the fractal of oneing like this or something. I don't know what gesture to make with my hands, which is quite adequate, but that is something disclosed when you reflect deeply upon intelligibility. It sounds, and by the way, Donald, I hope you know that I mean this as a compliment, not an insult. I consider myself a post-nominalist Neoplatonist. So hearing what sounds like a very Neoplatonic structure to reality, that really resonated with me. Now, I wonder what you would say, though, and maybe this goes to what you mean by consciousness. So Plotinus argues that the top thing, right, consciousness is, he takes intentionality to be a feature of consciousness, and that therefore consciousness always implies a duality, and that you need a one beyond that duality to explain the duality, and that therefore you pass beyond consciousness and thought. You pass both beyond consciousness and intelligence when you get to the one. Below it, he has, you probably know this, the nous, which is like all of these ones, all of the forms that, and they're like this. They're infinitely mirroring each other, like Indra's net. So I wonder what you think about that kind of argument. But I know that's an unfair question to just ask first, because it depends on, what you're meaning by conscious and what you're meaning by agent.
Right. So, by the way, I'll describe it, but of course the paper Objects of Consciousness has the math all laid out in it.
Sure.
But intuitively, right, when you're trying to boot up a theory, you want the smallest set of assumptions that you can possibly use that would boot up a general theory. And there's dozens and dozens of things you could think about it. You want a theory of consciousness to deal with, the self, is there a self? Learning, memory, problem solving, intelligence, and there's a bunch of things. Qualia, possibility of free will. There's tons and tons of things. So, but we can't throw in the kitchen sink. So what we do is we try to find the minimal aspects of consciousness that we will take as the miracles, as the fundamental assumptions of our theory. So we took two. We took that there are conscious experiences, and that conscious experiences probabilistically affect the other conscious experiences occurring. Those are and I just read in the last few weeks, looking at the modality, it turns out Leibniz says the same thing. He beat us by 300 years by saying that those were the two, if he was going to boot up a theory of consciousness, he would use those two things, the experiences and probabilistic relationships among them. So what we do is we take that idea that Leibniz beat me at 300 years ago, and we turn it into mathematics. I say a conscious agent basically is a probability space of possible experiences. So it could be an infinite probability space. So these are all the possible experiences of this conscious agent. So I write down a probability space. And then I use Markovian kernels, which is a very, very general formulation of some probabilistic relationships. So basically, we have what we call perception, decision, and action kernels, but they're all Markovian kernels. And you can take their composition and just have one Markovian kernel if you want. But we have then basically a social network of these probability spaces related by Markovian kernels. So it's a big social network, and it's a Markovian dynamics. And so when you look at that dynamics, that's what we mean by a conscious agent. And it is a theorem of that when you have two conscious agents, you can take just their tensor product and you will get a tensor product of spaces and kernels and so forth. And you get it satisfies the definition of a conscious agent. But in terms of consciousness and a deep thing about consciousness and experience, I realized after we wrote it down that I was forced by the mathematics to write down a probability space on which the experiences took place. So it's just sitting there. It's like a Platonic structure, just sitting there. What does that? So I months later look back and say, okay, well, what does that mean about consciousness? Well, that's clearly consciousness prior to experience. So we're forced to write down in our mathematics a structure that corresponds to a being without any particular experience that is happening. So but then the Markovian dynamics is really modeling the play of forms, of experiences that pop up and down on this fundamental being that is timeless and requires no experience. It is the field of potential for all experiences. So I realized later on that mathematics nicely intertwines with interpretations that we see from various spiritual traditions. But I didn't try to model the spiritual traditions. I was forced by mathematics. You can't talk about probability until you write down the probability space. You just can't do it. And so you're forced to do this. And I realized, the natural interpretation of that is being prior to experience, and then Markovian dynamics is the full set of experiences.